And welcome everyone to Brain Swap.
Hello.
For Friday, February 26th, 2016, where we are talking about all sorts of aspects of anime as we usually do. And today we're going to be talking about the question of the elements of an anime series that make for an effective short anime series. So something that is only a few episodes long, so 12 episodes or less, we would say. What makes for an effective and entertaining shorter anime series? Hi, Dee. Glad to see you, as always. And so, obviously, we have to kind of define our terms here as normal. And one of the concepts of that is, obviously what's short. So we're talking about a
400 episodes.
No. We're talking about a 12, 13 episode anime TV series or an OVA. Obviously not one of these hugely long OVAs. Some of them run very long. But
6 episodes, 4 episodes, 2 episodes.
Exactly.
3.
Yeah. So we're talking about those. And in terms of kind of defining our parameters for what's entertaining, we're talking about anime that tells its story, right? So there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's not just completely random elements. And you, it's something that engaged you or interested you or whatever. So something that was entertaining, something that you watch all the way through to the end. That's usually a good sign that you liked it. And it may have left you wanting more, but it told us a complete story, right? Yeah. So it's not something where you feel like they left a lot of the story or the characters on the table. You feel like the story they were telling was complete at the end, whether or not that you would like to see more of those characters or story.
So that would include series that are just that short series, or short series that are part of a larger universe.
Exactly.
But the universe, the other part of the franchise tells a different story.
Exactly. So we were talking about some examples of this beforehand. So the first Tenchi Muyo OVA is a self-contained story. You definitely want to see where the story goes afterwards, but it tells an effective story with those characters, kind of sets everything up and gives you those characters. And so I think that would qualify. And certainly there are plenty of people who say they watch that and enjoy it, and that's kind of their, that story works for them. Gunbuster is a great example Game Escape brings up, where that is very much a self-contained story. And it ends on a relatively final note, but you're curious to see where it's going to go. Seal Experiments Lane is one of the classic examples of a show where it tells a complete story, and it finishes at the end. There's definitely an ending.
It wraps up, unlike FLCL, Fooly Cooly, which left me saying, I want more, and there's a lot of loose ends, and what is this anime stuff doing to me?
That'd be a good example of a show that is certainly entertaining and interesting, and a lot of people enjoy, but I wouldn't necessarily hold up as an example of a short form story that satisfied everyone.
It was good from the standpoint that it was exciting, entertaining, engaging, but it left me saying, wait, that's the end. No. That can't be right. Well, they got to make more, and they never did. And that
another good sort of counter example would be Boogie Pop Phantom, where there's a lot of story, there's a lot of stuff, but you'd like to have more explanation. You'd like to find out more about the context and so forth, as opposed to most other self-contained anime series. So that would be kind of a counter example. What we're not looking for. We're looking more for those more self-contained, relatively self-contained stories. And now, as Dee points out, there's the question of visuals and how much you can express through visuals. A lot of times, a single visual can express a lot about a story and what it's telling about the characters in the setting.
A picture is worth $1,000 if you sell it to the right person.
So there are certainly aspects to that sometimes. I think anime does that in its own way, where rarely in anime will they have individual images or a small amount of visual imagery that tells a lot of backstory. A good example of a show that does do that would be Revolutionary Girl Utena, for example, where there's a lot of imagery early on with some exposition, but where they're explaining through a character's dress or a character's actions or a character's childhood memories, who they were and what they were trying to do.
Now, that's a tricky thing with storytelling when you have a shorter series, to try and get your audience up to speed on the background of these characters, who they are, and develop them to some degree. And visual representation is a perfect shorthand for getting a lot of information passed through without just dialogue or just showing scenarios, because you could take a whole season just developing people's behavior through scenarios, but representing it all at once as much as possible. And with a longer series, you can drag out how you do that and develop backstory as you go along.
Right, which you don't have time for in the shorter stories. And it is a good example of where anime usually does a very good job of establishing tone and mood through those visuals. So those backgrounds may be very abstract in a romantic comedy, for example, which tells you that the physical environment is not as important as the characters are. But in, for example, High School of the Dead, the zombie survival horror series, they spend a lot of time making those visuals, making that setting dark and brooding and foreboding. So yeah, that absolutely gets and I think High School of the Dead is another example of a series where it's kind of on the fence in this, where they get across a lot in the visuals, but it's not necessarily a satisfying self-contained story. Then it's trying to be more survival horror, which isn't really about telling a beginning, middle, end story in that sense. It's more about watching how characters react to the situation.
And horror is different than suspense, even though the two have some overlap. And one thing I saw mentioned earlier, self-contained episodes, such as Mushishi.
Oh yeah,
for the most part, seem to lend to a shorter series.
They can.
There can still be a story arc throughout the entire series, but a person can even watch it out of sequence and still get some enjoyment from it and feel some degree of closure.
Yeah. Derpy points out in the chat room, the character design is important to visual direction in a short show. Establishing your characters through visual design, having a character with angry red eyes, or having a character with an ahoge, which is the little hair sort of horn that the characters will have in the middle, which usually indicates that they're a little not quite brainy, shall we put it that way, and they lack some brain cells. Those things are important visual shorthand, which absolutely help to get across things. Lane's a good example, where by having these unusual character designs, it draws you into an unusual world. It signals this is not going to be a normal anime series.
How far can a storyteller go in creating a whole different world in a short story?
That's a very good question. It depends. I mean, one of the unusual things is that anime has an even further shorthand because it's referencing the original material. So you may have an anime series that's referencing an original manga where they're pulling elements from that and they're kind of referencing a larger story in the manga that you're not going to get even in the anime series. So you'll get so Haruhi is a good example of that, where there's more backstory, there's more character going or more character history going on that you don't get in the anime series. You might get later, but it's not foregrounded in the anime series, and it's something they can absolutely trade on. So that it is definitely complicated.
Would something like Boogie Pop, which has the light novels and several other things, would that be would that fall into the good short series category, because it leans a lot on that knowledge, which is outside of the series? Or outside of the anime series?
That's a good question. I think that's kind of on the fence, where on the one, like, I think Boogie Pop Phantom does an excellent job of telling the story it has, but I think it is relying on people to assume that is a larger context and to understand that larger context.
Yeah, we're just to reiterate, we're talking about maybe 13, 12 episodes or
Mhm.
a number of OVAs, something
Yeah.
that kind of stands on its own.
26 episodes is about 10 hours of content, minus commercials. So, I think that gets into longer form storytelling, beyond the 12 or 13 episodes. So I think so we've talked about those aspects. What do you think are the aspects of sort of character personality that work better in a short-term show than a long-term show?
I think with the short-term show, in order to develop the personality, it has to be a lot stronger. Where with a longer show, you can have subtle character personality traits.
Yeah.
Short show, you gotta make it stick real quick. When you throw it to the wall, everybody has to know.
Yeah.
With a long show, you throw out ideas, you can throw out a little crumb here and there. Eventually people will start to pick up on it and they'll be able to run with it. But with a shorter show, it's got to be blunt, in your face, sort of very over the top character to but not necessarily, but it helps.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this week, about the shorter series that I have enjoyed and the personalities in those versus the longer series. And I realized that there's actually not that much difference between the personalities in a longer series versus a shorter series. You think of shonen series, Dragon Ball Z or Fairy Tail, they have these very strong personalities.
They do.
Just as much as you have in a shorter series. But what I think is interesting is how in a shorter series, like you say, you don't have time to develop those characters. So I think you either develop the characters very dramatically, or you develop them very little, which means those characters have to be very carefully positioned relative to each other. Furikuri is a good example, where Naota has to be very passive for all of these wild characters around him to influence him and to have that effect on him.
It makes a nice contrast.
Yeah,
like contrasting characters between their ability to express themselves.
And those other active characters are active in different ways, right? So they can be more over the top, they can be strange. Lane, going back to that, is you have this very passive central character and other characters who aren't that active. But you have Alice, who is more strong-willed. You have her friends who have their own, who are almost against Lane. They really don't want to hang out with her much. You have her parents, who one of whom is much more into computers, the other is very passive. So you have these very different personalities all engaging in their own way, and nobody really changes in Lane. One of the things that's interesting about Lane is that everyone's very static throughout the course of the show, and Lane changes dramatically over the course of the show. In a lot of other anime series, the main character will have some significant change, but you see changes in different characters over the course of the show.
Well, does what impact do number of characters and folks?
That's a good question.
Because if you have too many characters that are vying for the limelight, so to speak, then it seems harder to get through each of their individual personalities.
Right. And to that point, and so D and Liquidus are asking about these larger franchises, and I think when you've got a self-contained OVA or other story within a franchise, I think that counts. As long as you can watch that show and enjoy it and understand it without having watched significant amounts of other things in the franchise, and I think that has succeeded in being a self-contained story, in the same way that I can write a story about characters and write those novels, and there may be all sorts of other stories I want to tell about them. There may be a lot of other content about them that doesn't even exist yet. And if you can enjoy that self-contained, that shouldn't be any different than watching a self-contained series about things where there are other adventures you just haven't read yet.
Sort of like Sherlock Holmes episodes.
Right.
Each episode each story can stand on its own. Of course, the more you know, the more you can pick up on his personality and how it's done each time.
Now, folks are suggesting in the chat room that comedy and lighthearted series are better for short stories.
Yeah, and you can do one-off gags, you
Yeah.
know, one-liners and quips and
Right. Although to say that, I think those aren't really series in this sense. They aren't really a self-contained story in this sense. It's more of a series of, like you say, gags and such. So I think it's that's judging them differently. In other words, you can absolutely have a fun self-contained short comedy series, but you're not going to judge it the same way you're going to judge a dramatic series, which is telling a beginning, middle, and end.
So what genre lends itself more towards short series and more towards long?
That's the thing. I mean, so obviously, if you've got a complex dramatic story, Monster being a good example, where it's about the basic premise: a surgeon saves the life of a man who turns out to be a serial killer, and so the surgeon goes after the serial killer trying to stop him because he feels kind of responsible. So it's this serious drama, and that's the kind of thing that you could technically tell that in 12 episodes, but that's the kind of complex, psychological story about him dealing with his guilt and with these other characters, and then the effects of this serial killer. That's not going to work as well in a 12-episode series. Yeah.
Would space operas be possible in shorter series?
I think it's going to be harder, definitely, because it's opera.
Opera in itself is extensive.
So yeah, I think that's a significant issue. Well, D, I mean, everything is a story, right? Everything tells a story. We're talking about a small series that tells a story.
So there can be several series or several stories within a series or within an OVA. There's different plots with it, different. There's the more we zoom into that, the more it gets kind of fuzzy.
Sure.
So, but the standard 12, 13 episode series that stands alone is kind of where we're focusing, or anything shorter than that. Would that include stuff like movies? I mean, because at some point the OVA becomes a movie. There's that fuzzy line.
We're getting into semantics at that point. I think, and the point here is not to say, well, because it's easy enough to talk about what makes for an effective movie, right? There's plenty of analysis of that. So the question here is, you have a short TV series, a short serial fiction, work. What makes that work?
What about webisodes?
Sure.
So the little 5-minute clip.
Absolutely. We don't see very many dramatic webisodes, though.
No.
Yeah, those are pretty much all
humor.
Quick, short
gag
comedies.
You don't even need to know the characters that they're referencing half the time.
Now, somebody in the chat room, and it scrolled by, talked about how a lot of the short series they enjoyed often end with some kind of dramatic twist. That seems to be an effective way of telling those stories, where you're moving in one direction and then suddenly everything changes at the end. I agree that
I
definitely
do like
works.
the twist.
Yeah,
the twist is definitely good.
Now, and what's interesting is that from a storytelling perspective, when you're building up to a twist, doing that in 12 episodes, I think is in a sense easier than building up over, say, 26, because you can establish a rhythm and establish a pattern and then break that and then show the results of that in a more condensed way than, I mean, imagine watching 20 episodes of a show and then suddenly everything changes.
Death Note.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, that's a good example. There's plenty that try to do that and not as well.
And that's one of the reasons why Death Note was so remarkable, was because they did do that so successfully. It was shocking that they did make that big change. People rarely do that in a show or a story, like a manga of that length, to completely change direction.
And one other thing that really lent to that was the way that they dealt with suspense.
Oh yeah, suspense.
Very, very, very good approach to suspense. Things like Bleach, where they pulled the suspense too long, eventually the interest dwindles. But
so let's talk about that a bit.
Series.
I think, because I think suspense is an important topic, especially for a shorter series. I'm thinking of there was an anime series a couple of years ago about detectives, and it told sort of longer form stories over the course of, I think, 2 or 3 episodes would be one mystery. And then there was a sort of a meta mystery that they were going to deal with over the course of the entire series. I didn't watch it, but the complexity there was trying to manage suspense when you only have 12 episodes. I think sometimes that works very well. Mushishi absolutely has that, although it's a longer series, but you have episodes. So I think it certainly can be done in a short form series, but it's a very different pace than you're going to get in a long, like Infinite Rebias, for example.
Yeah.
Rebias, 26 episode series, but you get that suspense building very carefully, very deliberately over the course of the show in a way that you're not going to get in 12 episodes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. What about things that require a unique knowledge? Say when you're building a world or a fantasy realm.
Yeah.
Knowing a background of things. How much of expecting your audience to have a certain level of knowledge of say mythology or Japanese authors or K-pop idols or what degree do you think does that play?
And that's that's a great point. A good example of that is Bakumatsu Rock, which came out I think last year, which tells the story of the Shinsengumi and the Bakumatsu and then the Meiji Restoration as pop idols and rock bands. It's very good and works very effectively. And so it's kind of this mashup of Meiji era and modern technology. And I found it a lot of fun and enjoyable, but it would be kind of like doing a story about Civil War generals where they're all race car drivers. Right. And you're seeing like the rivalry between the different generals and they're on this team and they're on that team. Like we would get that. But if you're from, Australia, and you just didn't grow up reading these stories, you'd watch and say, who, why are we, what's going on? So, and Bakumatsu Rock is, I think, 13 episodes. And so it's something, and very few people watched it because it requires that much context of understanding who the characters are and why they're making these jokes about their relationships. So yeah, I think that's a very important point. And so I think people do that to their peril. You can certainly do it depending on who your audience is, but I think that is something, the more you do that, the less likely you're going to have a show that people enjoy in that sense. Nobunaga can be done in a billion ways. We've seen all female Nobunaga and all sorts of craziness there. What about the elements of the story itself? Like what things do you think in the development of a plot, the development of, and I recognize plot and story are 2 different things, but in terms of like pacing and plot elements, what do you think work well or work poorly in a short-term series? What are the traps you can lay for yourself in that?
Oh, that's a good question.
We've talked about setup. Obviously, it's harder to set up a lot of a complex world in that time.
And we've talked about background knowledge.
Yeah.
And character. Dialogue can well-chosen words can reveal a lot about a character.
Yeah.
And a well-done series doesn't put in unnecessary things into the anime. Yeah. Everything is there for a purpose and a reason. Where if it's not, then it's really not adding to the story. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the lines of distinction between really well done and not as well done. Because you can go back and look at it and say, oh, now I know the significance of this. It had something to do with that.
Yeah.
I was just listening to what was going on, but I saw them, shovel the paper over across the desk and I said something. And now I know that had some significance while the other guy across the room was looking. And, there's so many things that can be done to build along in that respect. At the same time, having the dialogue that's rich in meaning
Yeah.
and significance. You know, not just visually, but
Boogie Pop Phantom being the canonical example
that's
of
a
that,
great example.
where just as we've said, one of the most deliberate shows we've ever seen in terms of every line of dialogue is telling you something about a character, what they're doing. Often lines of non-dialogue, just seeing how a character reacts or doesn't react to something.
the responses and even the way the response is, not just
Mhm.
the text, but the nonverbals of it. You know,
Mhm.
the voice, the size.
Yeah.
Everything adding to
Yeah.
the effect of the story.
Why does everyone call you Ponaru? There's the little lines. Oh, whoa, interesting. Yeah, Angel Beats. Actually, I think that's a great one to bring up. That Angel Beats is a show that did accomplish all this very effectively, where it's set in a very distinctive setting, with a variety of strongly delineated characters, and tells absolutely beginning, middle, and end. So for those unfamiliar, Angel Beats is a story where characters, a teenage boy basically wakes up in purgatory, effectively, which is a Japanese high school, which is kind of a funny thing. Anyway, and he's essentially caught in a war between the students who are all there, kind of waiting to pass on, and the administration, which is kind of waiting for them to get to a certain point psychologically where they can pass on. And by caught in a war, I mean literally like machine guns. It's very odd and wacky in terms of its premise, but then it has a lot of interesting psychological and arguably spiritual elements. So you have this, setting up, okay, it's a Japanese high school, but with these different elements to it of characters who are fighting and reacting in certain ways. And then you get their backstories and you find out why they're doing what they do. It's a very interesting concept in that sense, and yeah, you get a lot in that show.
Now you've brought up something I had one idea that I was going to talk about, but action, action packed events. So stuff with a lot of, say, choreographed fight scenes or things that are going on at a rapid pace. Seems to be the kind of thing that pulls me in to something that's going on, but it's got to be action with a meaning.
Yeah.
Well, now here's something I'm curious about. Linearity of time in storytelling.
Yeah.
Starting in the middle and working towards it. Flashbacks. Starting at the end. Here's where I am now and what led up to this. And starting at the end and working backwards. Do any of those work more effectively with short, or is it?
I don't know. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Certainly, Angel Beats is a good example, as Dee points out, where the character is dropped really into the middle of this situation with lots of relationships already established. Going back to Lane, there's a lot explained about the backstory of Lane as that show progresses. And heck, Boogie Pop Phantom. Boogie Pop Phantom is all about reacting to something that happened before the show started. So Infinite Bias, it's all about that ship and what's that ship, what's going on with the ship. So, but that said, like you're saying, you only have so much time. I certainly don't see, and this is kind of interesting, I don't see a big difference in linearity between short series and long series. Long series will do flashbacks, they'll have stuff bouncing back and forth, and short series will too. There doesn't seem to be a particular penalty to doing that in any big.
So that sort of passes through for each of them.
That's remarkable, actually. You think about it.
I've got to watch more anime.
Now, the interesting thing about action, I'm having a tough time thinking of a short action series.
I can think of a long one, but
right. For some reason, action now.
Shampoo. Well, no.
That's 24, I think.
Yeah.
Bacano would certainly be one. That's an actiony.
That did have a lot of action.
Yeah. But yeah, action seems to. Well, and granted, like you were saying, because action tends to engage us viscerally, no matter the context. I think it's easier to sell a longer term action series, right? Like, people are more willing to pay for a longer term story if you say there's going to be lots of action. If you say we're going to do this intense psychological story and it's going to be 50 episodes, that's going to be harder to sell. So I think action is something that works. Now, Durfee points out, and there's a lot of Gundam that is short action series. 0083 is certainly a very actiony Gundam series, Gundam Unicorn, as Durfee points out. Now, Gundam does have a backstory via the universe, but you don't need to have understood those backstories to watch those shows. Now, Unicorn probably more than most relies on that backstory. It would be hard to watch Unicorn and not understand the backstory. But a lot of the others would certainly work. 8th MS Team, 0083 would certainly work on its own. So that's there. And now Durfee points out also there are a lot of OVA actions, or action-oriented OVA series. That is true. You do get those things.
You know, it seems that something relying on a slice of life would already have a strong foundation to work from. Yeah, where something that's a sci-fi or fantasy realm, you have to create some sort of ground rules. This works in this universe. This doesn't. Yeah. So I would think that that would lend itself to it. But I'm trying to remember examples.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of strong slice of life series, and there really aren't that many that spring to mind. There's Strawberry Marshmallow. There's Nia Under 7, kind of. Well, it's kind of sci-fi-ish. But those are all comedies, come to think of it, which is kind of an interesting element of it. But certainly, you do see those stories. I think you're right. Slice of life, I think, lends itself more to a shorter series because it is more kind of slow paced, and it is something that you're not necessarily going to want to watch Slice of Life for 100 episodes.
A Quiet Country.
Yes. Oh. Good point. There's Slice of Life.
Slice of life and sort of post disaster or apocalyptic. I don't know.
Absolutely. And it's a great example of a show where they don't spend a lot of time establishing setting. Yeah. But you understand it through context. And just kind of the stuff that you understand. Now, Liquidus brings up the musical genre anime, the pop idol anime. Now, most of those are 26 episodes or longer, and they'll go to a couple of seasons. But they do have a slice of life element as well as the sort of light comedy aspects to a lot of those shows.
Do any of those go much further than 26, though?
A lot of them will have multiple seasons. So you'll get 26 episodes per season, and they'll do one or two of those. But not, I mean, certainly they don't go to many episodes. Necessarily.
Please, Teacher.
And I actually, Fisher, you're right. Please, Teacher was a great slice of life show, which is interesting because it had a lot of episodic elements to it, but it had kind of a through line of the main character's growth. So the background is that the main character actually has a disease that causes him to fall into a coma during which he does not age. And so he's entering high school, but he looks like he's like 12. And I think maybe actually be 1 or 2 years into high school. And we'll just say that a character sort of leaps into his life and starts changing things, which freaks him out because he's a very, he likes things to be the way they are. And so the theme of the show is about speed and acceleration. That doing this has increased the speed of his life, which was at a standstill, and that he's starting to pick up speed. And so that theme of him getting used to change and getting used to not just something happening, but things happening more and more quickly is kind of that element of the show.
I can relate to that.
Totally. And that's actually gets back to another question about these series is how much you can actually have happening in a given short series. When I think of like Tenchi, for example, or all these other things, you may have one significant change happening over the course of the show, one significant theme, but it usually doesn't get much more complex than that. It stays pretty simple.
Yeah, it's it's hard to weave in too many changes into a shorter series, because that means you have so many more loose ends to tie up
Mhm.
when you get closer to the end. And if you don't tie them up to some degree, people are left hanging. Okay, there's got to be a second season, or
Yeah.
why'd they do that? Why'd they end there? No, they
Mm.
can't do that.
Um,
Hajime Reme. Wow.
So yeah, and Hajime Renmei is a good example of a short slice, and that really is slice of life. So, and I should point out there is some controversy around the term of slice of life compared to like a school life show. So, you know, Please Teacher is more accurately more of like a school life show, where it's not really about just everyday life, although that is an important element. It's more about what's happening to these characters as they're interacting, their schoolmates.
Well,
that is certainly an issue.
what about things like Rin, which are pretty short series-wise, but long in each episode is I think 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, you got to count.
Does something like Tales of the Strange or Unusual, which are kind of like The Outer Limits or Twilight Zone, those kind of stories seem to fit well into the idea of beginning, middle, end.
Well,
and
but I don't think that they really make for good short series though. Because when I think of those, I think of Mushishi. I think of those other shows which can go on for many episodes because nothing's holding them back to 13 episodes or 12 episodes or 5 episodes. One of the nice things is that if you're telling weird stories every episode, there are all sorts of weird stories. So you can keep on.
Could turn that into a whole franchise.
Exactly, as people have. Absolutely.
Well, that's one thing I was surprised to hear, that Mushishi has another season now.
Yeah.
Is so? Would the success of some of these shorter series potentially be measured by follow-up? Further continued.
That's an interesting question.
Series OVA goes to production.
I'm impossible to say. I mean, it depends on what they're adapting. It depends on what's going on. I don't know. That's answerable. Actually,
tricky.
Yeah. So there's an interesting question. What's the difference between slice of life and drama? I would say what's the difference between slice of life, drama, and melodrama? Even further. But I think slice of life is notable for the fact that it is relatively low on drama. I think Slice of Life is a show in which characters, and there are certainly drama and melodrama, but that is not the focus of the show.
High School Rumble had all three. It had Slice of Life, it had drama, and then it went to melodrama. It was just over the top drama that so it's possible to have all of them, but that's not a short series. That's a relatively long series.
Yeah.
Bunny Drop or Usagi Drop?
Right. That so Sophronia, you're absolutely correct. The Bunny Drop was a short series that is about a two character. Although I would argue that the changes in those characters, certainly the change of the father is more significant than the change of the child, because the child is more growing up. She is having a relatively normal childhood as a result of his actions, and so it's less about her changing in the sense of a dramatic change because she wants to, and more the fact that, oh, good, now she has a reasonable parental figure, and so she is changing, in the way a child should.
How would that lean towards drama or towards slice of life?
I would call that's a good question. I think that contains elements of slice of life because it's focusing on those everyday moments, but also elements of melodrama. Because I think that is very much about those, I'm a new father. What do I do? What are my responsibilities with this child? And Fisher points out in the chat room, getting back to your earlier question about success, OVAs can also be part of that because the OVA can spin off the TV series. The TV series can inspire an OVA. So it all, bounces off each other. Yeah, Non Biori is another good example of a slice of life series. There's nothing serious going on. People aren't angry with each other. There may be some slight frustrations between characters and misunderstandings, but that's about it. Very very quiet series. So yeah, I think, and to that point, I think those sorts of shows, I think, do better in those shorter time periods. It's a little harder to maintain that appreciation of the everyday you get in Slice of Life over the course of 50 episodes. It can happen.
Yeah. It's too common at that point,
Right?
where if you were doing a period piece, you could really go into depth and throw in historical references and to some degree, of course, as long as you don't throw in too many anachronisms.
Yeah, exactly. Samurai Champloo, I'm looking at you. But yeah, actually, to that point, I mentioned Tsukigagi Ran before, which is it's a samurai. It's a female martial artist sort of road trip series about a samurai and a female martial artist in Edo era Japan. And
they existed?
Oh yes. And what's cool is how it used, and it's episodic, more or less. I think Samurai Champloo, but with all girls. And so on the one hand, you have sort of samurai action stories. On the other hand, that is set in the Edo era, so you get aspects of Edo era culture. So it's educational from that perspective, and it's something that you certainly could have extended on for a long period of time. But I think it worked very well as 12 or 13 episodes, because that's, there comes a point at which you are taught enough, stuff in a show, and you're kind of ready for something else, and you're ready for something a little lighter or whatever. So I think that's a good example of a show where you balance all those elements. So you have educational elements and action and so forth, but it doesn't outstay its welcome in that sense.
That's a good way of doing shorter series. They don't outstay their welcome.
Yeah. Ideally.
Some of them you want them to stay longer.
Exactly. Yes. And which gets back to the point. This is a fuzzy topic. Obviously, there are shows that you love and that were self-contained, but you still would love to see more and more and more of.
FLCL, but there was no closure.
No, we're never gonna get any more than that. No, that was one of those. Here you go, and we're done, and we're out. Mic drop.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Mic drop. That's exactly.
What's the Coronation Street of anime? So, long-running melodrama. We don't really have anything quite like that. I would say, I think Legend of the Galactic Heroes, which is like a 100-episode OVA. That's space opera, but it definitely goes, forever. But anime's a little too expensive for that. We certainly have long-running series like Sazai-san and Doraemon, but they're aimed at kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't really have that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's
super long-running.
Yeah, it's tricky to find something like that.
Yeah, it's not really the way it works. And again, remember, anime's aimed at a teen boy market mostly, and they're just not interested in that compared to television, where you can, everyone watches television, so you can find those things that just kind of stay on there forever because there's lots of adults to watch it.
I wouldn't mind seeing more romance, but something with some success in it, because there's so many romances that seem that they never get to the next step, and they can dangle that carrot in front of me for only so long before I say, this guy's never gonna get a chance, no matter how long the series goes.
Derpy asks, is Detective Conan the Doctor Who of anime? I have no idea what you mean. I don't even know how you can compare those two. They certainly have not been around for as long as each other. The Doctor Who's been around for a lot longer than Conan.
Gotta have the scarf.
Yeah. And you don't have the whole regeneration, new characters every time.
I would say the whole Gundam franchise is more in line, just because it keeps revitalizing itself.
Oh yeah,
there's a new
good point.
life to it every so often.
Yeah.
And that's one of the characteristics of Doctor Who. So.
Mhm. Yeah, well, no, Detective Conan's been around for, I mean, but you want the longest running anime series, that's Sazai-san. That's 7,000 episodes.
7,000.
Yeah, 7,100 and some, I think. at this
Longer than
point.
The Simpsons.
Way longer. Yeah, 1969 was when they did the first episode.
Is The
of that.
Simpsons still going on? They haven't stopped that
Yeah,
yet, have they?
yeah.
Wow.
they're still doing
Oh my
Simpsons.
goodness.
But yeah, definitely Sazai-san would be the longest running series. But that's a family comedy.
Hmm.
You know, the standard kind of, you know, kind of like The Simpsons, actually. But very Japanese. Yeah, the Japanese Simpsons.
I always think of Crown Shinchan.
Yeah,
There's,
that's another long
the
running one.
Bart Simpson of Japan doing his butt dance.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I think we've covered this topic pretty darn well. So thank you all very much for joining us today to discuss this. Tomorrow, or sorry, next week,
Tomorrow.
we'll be, not quite. We'll be discussing the question whether the sub-dub war is relevant anymore.
The sub-dub wars.
You know, is it even worth arguing about the superiority of subs versus dubs anymore when you can usually get the dub if you want it or not?
Coming to a podcast near you.
Thank you all very much for being part of this. We will hang out as usual looking at the chat room. So if you guys have questions on the chat room, please hang around there and we will answer your questions as we normally do. And if you're not in the chat room, please join us there. We like seeing people in the chat room and talking to them. So thank you all very much for watching, and we will see you all next week. Bye-bye.